The wedding venue looked perfect. Every marble column, every crystal chandelier, every carefully calculated angle of natural light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, all exactly as I had designed it 3 years ago. Harold R. Kingsley, master architect, creator of spaces where people celebrated life's most important moments. Too bad I was about to witness the end of my own family. "Harold, you're at table 12, Lillian announced without looking up from her clipboard, her voice carrying that particular brand of dismissive coldness she'd perfected over our 28 years of marriage. She stood near the main family table, resplendent in her designer mother-of-the-bride dress, a vision of elegance that had once made my heart skip. Now it just made my stomach turn. Table 12. I glanced across the opulent ballroom, my ballroom, and spotted it tucked away near the kitchen doors, next to the coat rack and what appeared to be Uncle Sal's oxygen tank, the overflow table, the place where you put the people you're obligated to invite but would rather forget. "Charming," I said, adjusting my cufflinks. "Nothing says loving family like being seated next to the emergency exits." Lillian's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched slightly, the only indication she'd heard me. She was too busy fussing over Gordon Stratton, the groom's father, whose hand had somehow found its way to the small of her back as they discussed flower arrangements. Gordon, at 61, still carried himself like the real estate mogul he was, silver-haired, expensively suited, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. "Daddy, please." Cassie appeared at my elbow, looking stunning in her wedding dress but wearing an expression I'd seen too often lately, the face of someone trying to keep everyone happy while slowly drowning in the effort. "It's just for a few hours. Can't we all just get along?" I looked down at my daughter, 26 years old, and still believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could make everyone love each other. "Of course, sweetheart. Wouldn't want to upset the delicate social ecosystem your mother has so carefully constructed." Cassie's fiancé Mark hovered nearby, nervously adjusting his bow tie. The kid was decent enough, but he had the misfortune of being Gordon's son, which meant he'd inherited both his father's weak chin and his tendency to defer to whoever spoke loudest in the room. Right now, that was definitely Gordon, who was regaling a small crowd with some story about his latest development project, while his hand remained proprietary on my wife's back. "The Stratton family has been so generous," Lillian was saying to her friends Janet and Trish, both of whom nodded with the synchronized enthusiasm of professional social climbers. "Gordon has offered to help us with some investments. Real estate, you know. Much more stable than Harold's artistic pursuits." Artistic pursuits. As if designing the buildings that housed half the city's elite was some kind of hobby. As if the mansion they all lived in, the one I'd designed and built with my own hands, was just a happy accident. I caught Gordon's eye across the room. He smiled, the kind of smile a shark might give a particularly plump seal. "Harold, great to see you, buddy. Hell of a venue you picked here. Really captures that, what do you call it, industrial chic vibe." Industrial chic. The man was standing in a ballroom that had been featured in Architectural Digest, a space that had taken me 2 years to perfect, and he called it industrial chic. I could feel my jaw tightening, but I kept my voice level. "Actually, Gordon, I designed this space. Every detail, from the acoustics to the way the light hits the dance floor at sunset. It's not industrial chic. It's precision engineering disguised as art." "Oh, right. I forgot you were in the building business too." Gordon's laugh was hearty and completely dismissive. "Well, it's certainly functional. Functional, like calling the Sistine Chapel a decent paint job." The pre-dinner cocktail hour dragged on with the kind of forced merriment that made my teeth ache. I watched my wife work the room like the social butterfly she'd always been, flitting from group to group with Gordon never more than arm's length away. Janet and Trish flanked them like well-dressed bodyguards, their laughter a little too loud, their smiles a little too bright. When dinner was finally announced, I made my way to table 12, where I was seated between Uncle Sal, who spent the entire meal discussing his prostate, and a distant cousin whose name I'd forgotten sometime during the Clinton administration. From my vantage point near the kitchen doors, I had a perfect view of the main family table, where Lillian held court like a queen at her coronation. Gordon sat to her left. Interesting, since traditionally that spot would have gone to the bride's father. Me. But I was here at table 12, watching my wife lean in to whisper something in her new best friend's ear, watching him laugh and place his hand on her thigh under the table like they were teenagers at prom. The speeches began. Mark's best man told embarrassing stories about college. Cassie's maid of honor got weepy about friendship. Then Lillian stood up, champagne flute in hand, and I knew I was about to hear something that would either break my heart or my last remaining thread of self-control. "I want to toast new beginnings," she said, her voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. Sometimes in life, we outgrow the things that once made us happy. We realize that we deserve better, that we can build something beautiful with people who truly understand us. Her eyes found mine across the room, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Here's to Cassie and Mark, and to all of us who are brave enough to embrace the future. The room erupted in applause. Gordon raised his glass with a knowing smirk. Janet and Trish beamed like they'd just witnessed the social coup of the century. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about an affair. This wasn't just about my wife falling for another man. This was about erasure. They weren't just planning to cut me out of their lives. They were planning to pretend I'd never existed at all. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the velvet envelope I'd been carrying all day. Inside was the deed to the house I'd planned to give Cassie and Mark as a wedding gift. A custom-built home worth just over $1 million, designed specifically for their future family. I'd spent months on the plans, incorporating everything I knew about how they lived, how they moved through space, what would make them happy. I stood up. The room gradually quieted as people noticed the father of the bride rising from his exile at table 12. "Since I apparently don't belong at the main table," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I thought it might be appropriate to reconsider what else doesn't belong." I held up the envelope. This was going to be my gift to the happy couple, the deed to a house I designed specifically for them. Custom everything, worth about $1 million too. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cassie's face went white. Lillian looked like she'd been slapped. "But you know what?" I continued, tearing the envelope in half. "New beginnings, right? Maybe they should build their own future, without any help from someone who's apparently outlived his usefulness." I let the pieces of the deed flutter to the floor like confetti. The silence in the room was deafening. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said, and walked out of my own daughter's wedding reception. The mansion felt different when I got home. Bigger, emptier, like a museum after closing time, full of beautiful things that no one was around to appreciate. I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and settled into my study, surrounded by the architectural awards and photographs that documented 30 years of building other people's dreams. "Guess I'll enjoy all this empty space," I muttered to the walls, but even my sarcasm felt hollow. The house phone started ringing around midnight. I let it go to voicemail, then my cell phone, then the house phone again. By the 3rd round, I was curious enough to listen to the messages. "Harold, this is ridiculous." Lillian's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Call me back immediately. We need to discuss your behavior tonight." "Dad, please pick up. She's really upset. Can we talk?" That was Cassie, sounding like she was about 12 years old again. "Mr. Kingsley, this is Gordon Stratton. I think we got off on the wrong foot tonight. Maybe we can grab lunch this week and clear the air." I deleted them all and poured another bourbon. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. but I was busy with more important things. See, one advantage of being an architect is that you understand how buildings work. Not just the pretty parts that people see, but the hidden infrastructure that keeps everything standing. The electrical systems, the plumbing, the structural supports that no one thinks about until they fail. The same principle applies to marriages, and I'd been ignoring the warning signs of structural damage for far too long. I started in Lillian's office, the converted bedroom where she managed what she called her consulting business, helping wealthy women redecorate their homes for obscene fees. Her computer was password protected, but she'd never been particularly creative. Her mother's maiden name plus our anniversary year, child's play. The email folder labeled Personal Private was a goldmine. 3 months of correspondence with Gordon, starting professional and gradually becoming intimate. Dinner meetings that turned into late-night hotel visits. Planning sessions for investment opportunities that looked suspiciously like schemes to move our joint assets into accounts I couldn't access. But the real treasure was buried deeper in her files, a folder labeled Future Planning that made my blood run cold. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning a complete financial takeover. Gordon had convinced Lillian that my artistic temperament made me a poor steward of our family wealth. The solution? Transfer everything into a trust managed by Gordon's company, with Lillian as the primary beneficiary. I would be relegated to a monthly allowance, like a child with a piggy bank. The mansion, my masterpiece, the house I'd designed and built with my own hands, was already in the process of being transferred to the trust, along with my art collection, my retirement accounts, and even the intellectual property rights to my architectural designs. I sat back in Lillian's chair, staring at the screen, and laughed. Actually laughed out loud. They thought they were so clever, these two middle-aged social climbers. They thought I was just some absent-minded artist who wouldn't notice his life being stolen out from under him. They forgot who taught Lillian about legal documents and financial planning. They forgot who had been managing complex construction contracts and million-dollar budgets since before Gordon bought his first strip mall. Most importantly, they forgot that I was the one who designed this house, including the parts they didn't know existed. I walked to my workshop in the basement, past the wine cellar and the utility room, to a section that wasn't on any of the official blueprints. Behind a false wall that looked like part of the foundation, I'd built a small office space, my private retreat when family life became overwhelming. It was completely soundproof, climate-controlled, and equipped with its own electrical and internet connections that didn't show up on the main house systems. This was where I kept the things that mattered most: original blueprints for my major projects, financial records going back 20 years, and, most relevantly, a comprehensive security system that monitored every room in the house. I'd installed the cameras years ago, back when we'd had a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. Lillian knew about the obvious ones: the front door, the garage, the main living areas. She didn't know about the ones in her office, the master bedroom, or the guest rooms where she'd been entertaining Gordon for the past 3 months. The footage was illuminating and damaging, and absolutely devastating if it ever became public. I spent the next 2 days cataloging everything: financial documents, email correspondence, photographs, video evidence, phone records that I pulled from our family plan account. I built a case file that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Then I called Rick Martinez, my former protege, who now ran his own architectural firm downtown. Rick owed me more favors than either of us could count. I'd given him his start, taught him everything he knew, and recommended him for half the major projects he'd landed in the past 5 years. Mr. K, Rick's voice was warm with genuine affection. How's retirement treating you? Like a root canal without anesthesia, I said. Listen, I need a favor, a big one, and it might get a little messy. What kind of messy are we talking about? The kind where you help me destroy some people who richly deserve it. There was a pause. Then Rick chuckled. When do we start? I gave him Gordon's address and a list of public records to pull: building permits, tax assessments, business licenses, anything that might reveal vulnerabilities in his empire. Rick had connections throughout the city planning department, relationships I'd helped him build over the years. If Gordon had any skeletons in his professional closet, Rick would find them. While he worked on Gordon, I focused on Lillian's support network. Janet and Trish weren't just friends, they were co-conspirators. Janet's husband owned a chain of high-end furniture stores that had been providing Lillian with inventory for her decorating business at suspiciously low prices. Trish worked for a luxury travel agency and had been arranging Gordon and Lillian's romantic getaways, billing them as business expenses. They thought they were untouchable because they moved in the right social circles, donated to the right charities, and knew how to keep their mouths shut. They forgot that every transaction leaves a paper trail, and every secret shared between friends eventually becomes ammunition. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to ruin all four of them: financial fraud, tax evasion, breach of fiduciary duty, and enough personal embarrassment to make them social pariahs for the next decade. But evidence was just the foundation. Now, I needed to build something beautiful on top of it. I was sitting in my hidden office reviewing the architectural plans for Gordon's penthouse when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Back off, or you'll regret it. A friend." I stared at the message for a moment, then started laughing. They thought they could intimidate me with anonymous threats. These people really had no idea who they were dealing with. I typed back, "Tell Gordon his security system has a vulnerability on the north side. Any decent architect could exploit it. Lucky for him, I'm not decent anymore." Then I turned off the phone and went back to my plans. Time to pay Gordon a visit. Gordon's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Meridian Tower, a gleaming monument to new money that I'd always found architecturally offensive. Too much glass, not enough soul. But it did have one redeeming feature. I'd consulted on the security system during construction, back when Gordon and I were still pretending to be friends. The rain was coming down hard as I parked 3 blocks away and walked through the downtown streets, collar turned up against the October chill. The beauty of designing a building's security is that you know exactly where the blind spots are. The loading dock on the north side, for instance, had a camera angle that missed a 6-foot section of wall where a maintenance ladder provided access to the service levels. I'd dressed the part: black jeans, dark jacket, leather gloves. Not because I was planning anything illegal, but because Gordon needed to understand that the rules had changed. The polite architect who smiled at dinner parties and made small talk about property values was gone. In his place was someone much more dangerous. The service elevator required a key card, but the emergency override was hidden behind a panel that I'd helped design. 30 seconds later, I was riding up to the penthouse level, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. Gordon's private elevator opened directly into his living room, a testament to both his ego and his poor understanding of security. I stepped out into a space that screamed expensive but whispered tasteless, all leather and chrome and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a backdrop for his narcissism. The evidence I was looking for was easier to find than I'd expected. Gordon's home office was a shrine to his own success, with filing cabinets full of contracts and correspondence that he'd apparently never considered securing. His computer was logged in, displaying an email conversation with Lillian about their plans for restructuring Harold's assets. I plugged in a USB drive and started copying files: financial records, business correspondence, and jackpot, a folder labeled personal that contained photographs and videos that would make Gordon's wife very, very interested in a divorce. But the real prize was in his desk drawer: a copy of the trust documents that would transfer my life's work into his control, along with a timeline showing that they'd been planning this for over 6 months. Long before the affair became physical, they'd been plotting to steal everything I'd built. I was photographing the documents when I heard the elevator chime. Gordon's voice carried across the apartment, loud and drunk and obnoxious. "I'm telling you, Janet, the old man is losing it. Did you see his face when he tore up that deed? Priceless." "He looked pathetic," came Janet's reply, "like a child having a tantrum. The best part is he's actually helping us. Now we don't have to worry about him interfering with the trust paperwork. He's basically declared himself mentally incompetent in front of 200 witnesses." Their laughter made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pocketed the USB drive and the photographs, then moved to the window to assess my exit options. That's when I noticed Gordon's pride and joy parked in his private garage 1 floor below, a pristine 1967 Porsche 911 that he'd spent the last year restoring. He'd bored everyone at the country club with stories about finding original parts and maintaining authenticity. The emergency stairs provided access to the garage level. Gordon kept a spare key hidden under the rear bumper, a security flaw I'd warned him about years ago. Within minutes, I was standing next to his precious car with a can of paint thinner I'd found in his maintenance closet. I didn't damage the car. That would have been criminal destruction of property. Instead, I carefully poured the paint thinner over his collection of custom Italian leather shoes, which he stored in the garage because his wife was allergic to the leather treatment. 12 pairs of handmade shoes, each worth more than most people's monthly rent, now looked like they'd been attacked by a very selective acid rain. I left a note on his workbench, courtesy of the pathetic old man. P.S. Your security system still has that vulnerability I mentioned. Might want to fix that. The elevator chimed again as I was heading for the stairs. This time it was Lillian's voice, breathless and excited. "Gordon, darling, I've been thinking about the house. Once the trust is finalized, we could completely redesign the master suite. Maybe knock out that wall Harold is so proud of and put in a proper sitting area. Whatever you want, sweetheart. It's going to be our house soon enough." Our house. The house I'd designed for my family, built with my own hands, filled with memories of raising my daughter and building a life I'd thought would last forever. I left through the loading dock, but not before activating the building's fire alarm system. Not to cause panic, just to ensure that Gordon and Lillian would have to evacuate the building and explain to the fire department why they were there together at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with angry messages. I ignored them and went to my hidden office to upload the files I'd stolen. Everything was automatically backed up to multiple cloud servers and copied to drives I'd hidden throughout the house. The next morning, I had breakfast on my terrace and watched the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. It was going to be a beautiful day for destruction. Rick called around 10. "Mr. K, you're going to love this. Gordon's got problems. Big problems. Tell me." 3 of his major projects are built on wetlands that weren't properly surveyed. The EPA is sniffing around, and if they find violations, he's looking at millions in fines and remediation costs. Plus, I found some interesting discrepancies in his permit applications. Dates that don't match, signatures that look suspicious. How suspicious? The kind that might interest the district attorney. I smiled. Send me everything. And Rick, get ready for Phase 2. What's Phase 2? We're going to a party. The annual Coastal Children's Charity Gala was the social event of the season, held every October at the exclusive Ocean View Country Club. 500 of the city's most prominent citizens gathering to write tax-deductible checks and pretend they cared about underprivileged kids. Lillian had been on the organizing committee for 3 years running, and this year she'd somehow maneuvered herself into the position of event coordinator. It was her chance to cement her status as a social power player, especially with Gordon's money backing her ambitions. I hadn't planned to attend. My invitation had been rescinded after the wedding incident, as Lillian was apparently calling it. But Rick's sister Carmen was a civil rights attorney who'd done legal work for several committee members, and she owed me a favor for designing her law firm's offices at cost. You want me to be your date to a charity gala? Carmen asked when I called her. Harold, I'm flattered, but you're not exactly my type. It's not romantic, I assured her. It's tactical. I need someone there who can witness what's about to happen and provide legal cover if things get complicated. What kind of complicated? The kind where several prominent citizens discover that their private business has become public entertainment. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Are we talking about anything illegal? Not illegal, just illuminating. I'll pick you up at 7. The Ocean View Country Club was decorated like a fairy tale, all twinkling lights and elegant drapery. The kind of event that Lillian lived for, where she could network with the wealthy and powerful while convincing herself she was making a difference in the world. I spotted her immediately, holding court near the silent auction tables in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. Gordon was beside her, looking every inch the successful businessman in his custom tuxedo. Janet and Trish flanked them like well-dressed attack dogs, their smiles sharp enough to cut diamond. Harold Kingsley, a voice behind me said, I thought you weren't coming this year. I turned to find David Chen, the club's president, and one of my oldest friends, or former friends, based on the coolness in his tone. Change of plans, I said. Decided I didn't want to miss Lillian's big moment. Look, Harold, I know things have been difficult since the separation. We're not separated, I interrupted. We're just exploring new living arrangements. David's expression suggested he'd heard a different version of events, probably from Lillian, who'd always been skilled at controlling narratives. Carmen appeared at my elbow, stunning in a midnight blue dress that made every man in the room take notice. Sorry I'm late, she said, kissing my cheek with just enough familiarity to start rumors. Traffic was murder. I introduced her to David, who was clearly trying to reconcile my presence with whatever story he'd been told about my mental state. We made small talk for a few minutes before I excused myself to visit the men's room. Actually, I went to the club's media room, where the audio-visual equipment for the evening's presentation was housed. The student I'd hired from the local community college was waiting with a laptop and a nervous expression. Are you sure about this, Mr. Kingsley? He asked. This could get me in serious trouble. Only if someone finds out you helped, I said, handing him an envelope containing $5,000 in cash. And that's not going to happen, because you were never here. He plugged his laptop into the presentation system and uploaded the files I'd prepared. Then he disappeared through the service entrance, leaving me alone with enough evidence to destroy 4 lives. I returned to the main ballroom just as dinner was ending, and the evening's program was beginning. The club president made some remarks about the importance of charity. The guest speaker, a local news anchor, talked about the children who would benefit from the evening's donations. Then Lillian took the stage. She looked radiant up there, confident and poised in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her 28 years ago. She talked about the committee's hard work, the generosity of the donors, the bright future they were building for the community's children. Sometimes, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, we have to leave behind the things that no longer serve us. We have to be brave enough to embrace new possibilities, new partnerships, new ways of building something beautiful. Her eyes found mine across the room, and she smiled. The same smile she'd given me at Cassie's wedding, sharp and dismissive and cruel. And now, she continued, I'd like to share a special presentation about the impact your donations will have on our community's future. The lights dimmed. The screen behind her flickered to life, but instead of heartwarming footage of children at play, the audience was treated to a slideshow that would have made the National Enquirer weep with joy. The first image was a photograph of Lillian and Gordon kissing in his penthouse elevator, taken by his own security camera. The timestamp showed it was from 3 weeks ago, during what Lillian had told me was a committee planning meeting. Gasps rippled through the audience. Lillian spun around to look at the screen, her face going white. The next slide was an email exchange between Gordon and his accountant, discussing the best way to minimize Harold Kingsley's access to marital assets, while maximizing Lillian's control over the trust structure. Then came the financial records, showing how Janet's husband had been providing Lillian with stolen merchandise for her decorating business, and how Trish had been helping them launder money through fake travel expenses. The final slide was a copy of the trust document that would have transferred my life's work into Gordon's control, along with a timeline showing exactly how long they'd been planning to steal everything I'd built. The room erupted into chaos. Phones appeared as people started recording and photographing the evidence. Lillian stood frozen on the stage, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Gordon was pushing through the crowd toward the media room, but Rick intercepted him with a smile and a firm hand on his shoulder. "Going somewhere, Gordon?" That's when Cassie stood up. My daughter rose from her table near the front of the room, still in her honeymoon glow, but with steel in her spine that reminded me of her grandmother. The room gradually quieted as people realized she was about to speak. "I want everyone to know," she said, her voice steady and clear, "that I found out about my mother's affair 2 months ago. I also know about the financial planning she's been doing behind my father's back." Lillian's face crumpled. "Cassie, please. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Cassie interrupted. "You've been planning to steal everything Dad worked for, and you've been using me and my wedding as cover for your scheme." She turned to address the room. "My father is the most honest, hard-working, generous man I know. He designed half the buildings in this city. He built the house I grew up in with his own hands. He taught me that integrity matters more than money, and that family loyalty goes both ways." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "I'm ashamed that it took him exposing the truth for me to find the courage to stand up to my mother's manipulation." The silence in the room was deafening. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding my daughter's courage. Janet and Trish were already heading for the exits, but Carmen had anticipated that. She intercepted them at the door with a stack of legal documents. "Ladies," she said with a smile that could have frozen champagne, "you're being served with civil subpoenas. Congratulations. You're now key witnesses in multiple fraud investigations." I walked to the front of the room, where Lillian stood on the stage looking like her world had just collapsed, which, to be fair, it had. "Hello, darling," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Enjoying your big moment?" She stared at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "How could you do this to me?" "Do what? Tell the truth? Share your accomplishments with people who care about you?" I gestured to the crowd of shocked faces. "These are your friends, Lillian, the people you've been impressing for years. Don't they deserve to know who you really are?" Gordon appeared at her side, his face flushed with rage. "You son of a bitch. You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what you've just started." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I know exactly what I've started. Rick, would you mind sharing what you found about Gordon's business practices?" Rick stepped forward with a folder full of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should know that Mr. Stratton's construction company has been violating environmental regulations for the past 5 years. The EPA raid on his offices is scheduled for Monday morning." The crowd murmured with fresh shock. Gordon's face went from red to pale in the span of a heartbeat. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" I smiled. "I guess we'll find out Monday, won't we?" That's when the police arrived. I'd called them myself, of course. Not to report any crimes. I'd been very careful to stay within legal boundaries, but to request a welfare check on my property. I'd received reports of suspicious activity at my residence, possible break-in in progress. The officers who responded were professionals, courteous and thorough. They found Gordon's Escalade parked in my driveway, Lillian's Mercedes beside it, and clear evidence of forced entry through the back door. I arrived home just as they were leading Gordon out in handcuffs. "Harold!" Lillian rushed toward me, her evening gown torn and her makeup smeared. "Thank God you're here. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." "Is it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because it looks like you broke into my house." "It's my house too," she screamed. "I live here." "Actually," Carmen said, appearing beside me with another stack of legal documents, "as of this afternoon you don't. Harold filed for legal separation and obtained a restraining order. You're not supposed to be within 500 feet of this property." Lillian stared at her, then at me, then at the police officers who were clearly losing patience with the domestic drama unfolding on my front lawn. "You can't do this," she said. "I have rights. We're married." "We were married," I corrected. "Past tense. As of today, you're just someone who broke into my house and tried to steal my property." The evidence was overwhelming. They'd forced the lock on the back door, disabled the alarm system, and been caught in my study trying to access my safe. Gordon had a crowbar in his hand, and Lillian had a bag full of my financial documents. Janet and Trish had been waiting in the car, engines running, ready to serve as getaway drivers for what was clearly a planned burglary. The police arrested all four of them: breaking and entering, attempted theft, conspiracy, violation of a restraining order. The charges would probably be reduced in plea negotiations, but the damage to their reputations was already done. The story hit the local news before they'd finished processing the paperwork. Prominent socialites arrested in home invasion. The footage of them being led away in handcuffs was priceless, especially the shot of Gordon trying to hide his face behind his hands while wearing an expensive tuxedo. Cassie and Mark arrived while the police were still taking my statement. My daughter looked exhausted, like she'd aged 5 years in the past week. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she said, throwing her arms around me. "I should have stood up to her years ago." "You were trying to keep the family together," I said, holding her tight. "That's not your job, sweetheart. It never was." Mark stood awkwardly beside us, clearly unsure of his role in the family drama. "Mr. Kingsley, I want you to know that I had no idea what my father was planning. If I'd known, you would have been in an impossible position," I said. "Your father put you there, not me. The question now is what you want to do going forward." He squared his shoulders, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like a man instead of a boy. "I want to do the right thing, whatever that takes." The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, media interviews, and phone calls from old friends who'd been fed lies about my mental state and financial problems. The truth was spreading faster than gossip, and the social circle that had shunned me after the wedding was suddenly very interested in rebuilding those bridges. Rick kept me updated on Gordon's legal troubles. The EPA raid had uncovered enough violations to trigger a federal investigation. His construction company was facing millions in fines, and several of his major investors were pulling out of projects. Lillian's decorating business collapsed overnight when her clients realized she'd been overcharging them for stolen merchandise. Janet's husband was under investigation for insurance fraud, and Trish had been fired from the travel agency for embezzling client funds. But the real satisfaction came from watching their social standing evaporate. These were people who lived for status, for the approval of their peers, for their positions in the community hierarchy. Now they were pariahs, whispered about at dinner parties, and excluded from the events that had once defined their lives. I could have felt sorry for them. I probably should have felt sorry for them. Instead, I felt free. 3 months later, I was standing in the same ballroom where Cassie's wedding reception had taken place, but this time the occasion was very different. The venue was hosting a charity auction for the Children's Hospital, and I was the guest of honor. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same room where I'd been exiled to Table 12 was now celebrating my donation of architectural services for the hospital's new pediatric wing. The same people who'd whispered about my breakdown at the wedding were now bidding enthusiastically on sketches and blueprints I'd donated to raise money for sick children. Cassie and Mark were at the main table, along with Rick and Carmen, who'd become more than just my attorney over the past few months. David Chen, the club president who'd questioned my sanity just 3 months ago, introduced me as one of our community's most generous and visionary leaders. The legal proceedings had wrapped up the week before. Lillian had pleaded guilty to breaking and entering in exchange for probation and community service. Gordon was facing federal charges that would likely send him to prison for 2 to 5 years. Janet and Trish had accepted plea deals that included restitution and permanent bans from several professional organizations. None of them were in the room tonight. They couldn't afford to be, both financially and socially. I'd rebuilt my relationship with Cassie, who'd moved back into the guest house while she and Mark figured out their next steps. She was working with a therapist to process years of emotional manipulation, and Mark was starting his own business with a loan from me. No strings attached, no family trust complications. The auction raised over $2 million for the hospital. When it was over, I found myself on the terrace overlooking the ocean, nursing a bourbon and watching the moonlight dance on the waves. "Enjoying your victory?" Carmen asked, joining me at the railing. "Is that what this is?" I asked. "Victory? You tell me. 3 months ago, you were the wronged husband everyone pitied. Tonight, you're the philanthropic hero everyone admires. Your wife and her conspirators are facing legal consequences for their actions. Your daughter has chosen your side. Sounds like victory to me." I considered that. "I suppose it is, though it doesn't feel quite how I expected." "How did you expect it to feel?" "More satisfying, I guess, more complete." Carmen smiled. "Revenge is like architecture, Harold. The planning is often more enjoyable than the finished product." She was right, of course. The months I'd spent building my case, gathering evidence, orchestrating the perfect moment of exposure, that had been exhilarating. The actual destruction of my enemies' lives had been necessary, but not particularly enjoyable. "So what now?" she asked. "Now I build something new," I said. "Something better." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the ocean and thinking about the future. Behind us, the party continued, full of people who wanted to be associated with success and generosity and social standing. I'd learned something important over the past few months. The same people who would abandon you when you appeared weak would flock to you when you demonstrated strength. It was a useful lesson, though not a particularly comforting one. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it, expecting some social media notification or business inquiry. Instead, it was from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your victory. You played the game better than we did. Lillian." Reaching out from whatever reduced circumstances she now found herself in, offering what might have been respect or might have been one final manipulation. I showed the message to Carmen, who raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to respond?" I thought about it for a moment, then deleted the message without replying. "Some conversations," I said, "are better left unfinished." The party was winding down. Guests were saying their goodbyes, making plans for future social engagements, discussing the success of the evening. I shook hands with donors, accepted congratulations from old friends, and posed for photographs with hospital administrators. As the crowd thinned, I found myself face to face with Cassie, who looked radiant in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For showing me who you really are. For teaching me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary." I hugged my daughter, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with family. "I'm proud of you," I told her. "Not for choosing my side, but for choosing it all, for deciding what kind of person you want to be." "I learned from the best," she said. As we walked to the parking lot together, I reflected on the events of the past few months. I'd set out to destroy the people who'd betrayed me, and I'd succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. But somewhere along the way, I'd also rebuilt relationships that mattered, found new love, and rediscovered my own worth. The architect in me appreciated the symmetry. I'd torn down the old structure and built something better in its place. Carmen was waiting by my car, keys in hand. Ready to go home? Home. The mansion that had once felt like a museum now felt like a sanctuary. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. The space I'd designed for a family was finally being used as intended. Ready, I said. As we drove through the city streets, past buildings I'd designed and spaces I'd created, I thought about legacy. Not the kind that gets carved on tombstones or written in obituaries, but the kind that lives in the people you've touched and the choices you've inspired them to make. Lillian had taught our daughter that family was about maintaining appearances and social status. I'd shown her that family was about loyalty and truth and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Gordon had demonstrated that power came from manipulation and control. I'd proven that real power came from integrity and careful planning and the willingness to accept consequences for your actions. Janet and Trish had lived as if friendship meant enabling bad behavior and covering up uncomfortable truths. Cassie would now understand that real friendship required honesty and courage and the strength to say difficult things when they needed to be said. The lessons would outlive all of us. That was the real victory. We pulled into my driveway, past the security gates, and up the winding path to the house I'd built with my own hands. The windows glowed with warm light, welcoming us home to a space designed for love and family, and the kind of happiness that can only be built on a foundation of truth. I'd started this journey as a wronged husband, seeking justice. I was ending it as a man who'd reclaimed his life and his dignity, surrounded by people who valued him for who he really was rather than what he could provide. It had taken 63 years, but I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building a life so good that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. Carmen took my hand as we walked to the front door. Any regrets? I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. Just one. What's that? I should have done this 20 years ago. Behind us, the city sparkled in the darkness, full of buildings I'd designed and lives I'd touched and stories still being written. Ahead of us lay whatever came next, new projects, new relationships, new opportunities to build something beautiful. I'd torn down everything that was false and built something true in its place. The architect's ultimate achievement, creating a structure that would stand the test of time.